I didn't. That's much better. So we are recording the session, so it will be available. If you do need to leave, that's absolutely fine. Right, so without further ado, I think I will hand over to Romina and hear what she has to do. Romina, are you going to be presenting anything? Would you like to be made co-host?
Yes, yes, yes.
Do that.
I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's test this. Oh, it says that host disabled participant screen sharing.
I should have just enabled that again. Can you try again?
Yes, perfect. Okay. Can you all see my screen now? Yes.
Yes,
Can you yes, perfect. Thank you. It's just that I only have one screen, so unfortunately, I'm not looking at you right now. So my name is Romina from Sustainability Victoria, and today we also having here Glenda James and Simon Hume. So they'll be also able to answer your questions if you have any questions after this presentation. So first, before moving towards the top tips for a great submission, I would like to congratulate Altona Green Primary School and Riverwalk Primary School. They were two of the winners of the ResourceSmart Schools of the Future Challenge and competition. The entries closed on June the 24th, and we draw winners on June 25th. And I can see that Hannah Dallas is in here. So congratulations, Hannah. And I was wondering, Hannah, if you would like to share your experience completing the challenge, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a really great experience for the whole cohort because we were completing a unit on caring for the environment, and we had the opportunity to work alongside Friends of Skeleton Creek to go on an excursion where the students explored a number of different areas of biodiversity. So it linked in really nicely with the work that we'd done, and it gave a really good, I guess, motivating product for them to work towards at the end, and to feel like they had a voice with and a place to channel all the things that they'd learned. So yeah, the timing couldn't have been better, and it was really great to be involved, and the videos were really easy to follow as well. I think that all the teachers on the team appreciated that, because not everyone comes from a sustainability background or an environment education background. So having that just be very easy to implement made a difference, I think, in the uptake for the team.
Thank you, Hannah. I was wondering, can you see, I am right now at the ResourceSmart Schools of the Future Challenge competition slide. Is that what you're seeing as well? Oh,
Yeah,
I'm
that's
sorry.
what I can see.
So how about now?
Yes, I can see that one.
Perfect, good. Thank you, Hannah. I'm glad you had fun, and I'm glad that the process of the workshops were positive for you. And congratulations again. We also Riverwalk Primary School, as you can see in there, their final project was a veggie patch. So after completing the workshop and after brainstorming what students would like to do, and after following all the processes that you can find in the workshops, they came up with this veggie patch, and they created this little module that you can see in here. And well, I just wanted to share this with you and encourage you to have a look at the resources. This will remain available on our website, and they are suitable for students from primary up to year 12, and also for student action teams. We had many schools working with more than 1 year level. And yes, congratulations to the winners of Western Metro region. And now I'm going to move towards the top tips for a great RSS module submission. I would like to confirm if you can see that screen at the moment, like that heading.
Yes, yeah.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so when you're completing your modules and then you want to send them for assessment, it is always very important to to assume really that assessors or people really working with your module don't know anything about your school. So even if your school has has amazing projects undergoing, or they are implementing a specific project, or they have a great website, the assessor really doesn't know that. So it's very important that whatever you are providing a supporting document, or whatever comment you're leaving a supporting comment, please make sure that it provides enough context for assessors to have a vision of what's happening in your school for that specific module. So always have that in mind. Assume that assessors don't know anything about your school. Then this is very important. So because when we're assessing modules, sometimes we realize that the school put lots of effort completing all the actions, but then they forgot to keep their bills up to date. And unfortunately, that's a reason for us to send the module back, because that's one of the requirements. You have to have your bills up to date. And so when you're submitting your module, you're going to find out that when you include your bill, the status of your bill will be either green or yellow. Those are the ones that are sufficient for you to pass that that action. But then if your bill's status is purple or red, then unfortunately we're going to have to send the module back. And in that case, before you hit submit, we invite you to talk to your facilitator, or just to contact us as well directly. And then we can walk you through on how to make those bills, how to make them available for module submission. Maybe there's an element that in the bills part of the online system that you probably haven't seen, or you forgot to include a detail or something. Well, in that case, if your bill status is showing either purple or red, just give us a call or contact directly to your facilitator so we can help you with that. Then this might sound very simple, but sometimes we find out that some module submissions, the answers, like the comments or the supporting documentation attached, is not really addressing the question. So please make sure to read the question and to ensure that your response is actually answering that question. For example, we have, this is one of the actions of the biodiversity module. And in this one, you can see that there's more than one question in the sentence. So we're talking about policies, targets, and action plans, and if these have been approved by your school council. So normally, normally schools will provide a SEMP, a school environmental management plan, that includes policies, targets, and action plans. So if you're doing that and that has been approved, then that's great, because you're already ticking. So I don't really like to use ticking, but you're answering all the questions that you can find in this particular sentence. But if that's not the case, then please make sure that you are uploading your policies, that you're including your targets, and that you also have the action plan approved by your school council. And I apologize, my computer is about to die, so I have to connect the charger. If you excuse me 1 second. Okay, I'm back. And then the same, like if you have something to say, maybe that's something that, for example, if you couldn't get a signature, but then like you obviously you do have those targets approved, then leave a comment, and please make sure that the comment is very specific and it provides context for the assessor to understand how are you completing this action. And then, so this is, I find this one very interesting, because it happens really often. So please make sure to ensure the availability of your supporting documentation, your attachments. For example, we have I included an image in there, and I apologize because it is in Spanish, because my computer Google account is in Spanish, but you can have, like, we have the log in there. So it's basically saying that I don't have access to the link that you provided as part of your supporting documentation. And we find that with newsletters as well, and also with internal school intranet. So please make sure to provide links that anyone can access, or maybe you can just take a screenshot or turn it into a PDF. So that way you're going to make sure that that evidence will remain available for everyone. So this is very common. So I would strongly suggest you have a look at that when you are working on your module submission. Then, so we also have, so another interesting point is it's about the comments. So when you are like leaving a comment, just make sure to provide, to consider the basic questions of who, how, why, where, and when. For example, if you're talking about a specific professional development opportunity, and you want to leave a comment, just make sure who delivered the workshop, when, what was the context, who attended. Basically, just try to provide like a very detailed context for this activity, because if you don't have images, then it's really hard to picture how this action occurred in the past. And also provide current supporting documentation is really important. So because of COVID, obviously the module submission was a little bit more flexible around this area, because, well, schools really, not many schools were able to access their premises in the first place. But now that things are getting to a more normal place, if you like, please make sure that whatever supporting document that you are providing, make sure that it's either underway or that has been complete within the past 12 months. And finally, sometimes I find that schools really forget about this one, and this one is very important. Make sure to provide a final comment and include details and sharing your experience and providing some context for the assessor to have an idea of how was your journey completing your model submission. It's a good idea to round. It's a good way to round your story, but it's a good opportunity to provide some feedback, so we know what's happening on site. So I think those are like the key issues, or I guess the key tips to consider when you're working on your module submission. And that's well, I think that's from us. And if you have any questions, please let us know. We're here. Simon is here, I'm here, and Glenda is here. So if you have any questions, please, this is the moment.
Thanks, Romina. Does anyone have anything they'd like to take this excellent opportunity to ask? I'm sure questions will come up as we go along. So yeah, thank you, Romina. That was very, very useful, and I've saved all of those tips.
Nicole, I might just add.
Yeah.
The other thing to think of is that it's great to think about it from the assessment point of view, but also think about it from if another teacher or someone else has to take over from you, the more detail you put in there, the easier it's going to be for someone to take over. So say, for example, that example that Romina gave about doing PD, if someone can read, oh yeah, we did some biodiversity PD with EEB, and they're looking to do some, and the new person's looking to do something, they know to contact EEB because that's who the school's previously done it with. It's not just about telling the assessor what you've done, but also helping anybody that will take over in the future, especially when it comes to renewal and all those sorts of things. So think about all the different ways that information is going to be useful.
I will also like to add something else. I didn't include this in here, but I've noticed, I don't know, Simon, if you have noticed the same, but sometimes schools have these amazing websites that include a sustainability tab, And they just mentioned that like at the very end of their modules, in like a very tiny comment, I would strongly suggest if you have a website dedicated for your green team, that is obviously accessible for everyone and not necessarily through a password or through a specific intranet, but like a website that it's open for everyone, please share that one like at the very beginning, because that will give the assessor an idea of really what's happening at your school. And yes, so I think that I think we've covered like the main aspects of a module submission.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was extremely helpful. And yeah, some great notes that we've got there. I mean, I really do appreciate that. So yeah, I saw lots of people scribbling away there, which is brilliant. And I have also taken note of those, and I'm happy to put them into a document. I don't know if you actually have a hard copy of that, Romina, that you'd be happy to share with us.
Yes, absolutely. I can send you the PowerPoint, and you also then you can have access to the website of the Schools of the Future in case that you want to visit the workshops.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Thank you for making the time to talk to us too.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you. And you're more than welcome to contact us if you need anything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Moving on, we're going to
Bye, everyone. We have to go, but thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'll see you all later.
Okay, you're missing out on a great talk, so maybe keep the audio on in the background.
A good idea. It's a good idea. Thank you.
Yeah, take care. All right, everyone, we're going to be hearing from Professor Anne Sanson now. Professor Sanson is an honorary professorial fellow at the University of Melbourne, where her research career has principally focused on the social and emotional development of children, adolescents, and young adults. When Anne became aware of the implications of the climate crisis for children and young people, her work quickly shifted towards seeking to understand the impacts of climate change on young people all around the world, how they were responding to the awareness of this threat and the threat that it poses on their future lives, and how parents, teachers, and professionals can get support or can best support the children to engage effectively in this crisis. Anne has over 200 different publications. She's a fellow of the Australian Psychological Society and the International Society for the Study of Behavioural Development. She's also a convener of the Durban Climate Action Now and a local community, which is a local community action group. So we are very privileged to have Anne with us today, and I will hand straight over to Anne. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. So thank you, Nicole. Nice to have this opportunity to speak to you guys who are, involved in sustainability education. Looking forward to hearing from you too. So I've got lots of slides and I'll go through them fairly fast, but do just yell out if you've got questions that you want to ask as we go along, or put questions in the chat that we can look at later too. Okay, there we are. Okay, so Nicole mentioned how I became aware of the climate crisis and really started to think the work that I had been doing for the main part of my career, which was mostly longitudinal studies following children from infancy right through to adulthood, and looking at the factors that lead to problems arising, but also the factors that lead to them being resilient and doing well in their lives. I came to think, well, if I'm not actually handing on a livable planet to the next generation, there's not a lot of point in this work that I'm doing. So I really now am focused on kids and climate change as my main retirement interest. I think it's good just to remind ourselves, I'm sure you all know about the reality of climate change and the situation we're in, but I think it's good to bring it to the front of our minds when we're talking about this stuff. So here's just a few things that people that we should listen to have said about the climate crisis. So the Lancet, the leading medical journal, and also the World Health Organization describe it as the greatest global health threat that we're facing. The Pope regards it as the greatest moral challenge of our time. There are so many issues to do with justice and injustice related to climate change. UNICEF, the United Nations Children Fund, describes it as the greatest intergenerational challenge in terms of what my generation and yours are handing on to the next generation. Defense departments around the world are really worried about how it's going to lead to so much more conflict, both within states and between states, as we confront resource scarcity, scarcity of food, scarcity of water, scarcity of land to live on, and how that's going to really exacerbate conflicts. So the United Nations Security Council describes it as a threat multiplier. And then, of course, our scientists have been telling us for a long time that what we are doing is facing an existential threat, which means that the lives of millions, if not billions of people is at risk. And we're also facing the risk of the collapse of human civilization. So it's heavy stuff that we're dealing with when we're talking about the climate crisis. This is I know that you all know the science of climate change, but just to remind ourselves, this is the famous Keeling curve from measurements in Hawaii. The top graph shows carbon dioxide emissions over the last 300 years. And you can see how it was pretty stable until the time of the Industrial Revolution, when it started to creep up. But then it's after the Second World War when we started on these very, luxurious consumerist lifestyles that we have now, that it's so sharply escalated. We still come across some people who say levels of carbon dioxide have always gone up and down, and they're quite right. The bottom graph is over 800,000 years, and you can see how levels have gone up and down, but never have they done anything like what we're doing now. So we're now at nearly 416 parts per million now of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The last time it was this high was 2.6 million years ago, when there were trees growing in the Antarctic and sea levels were 25 meters higher than they are now. So it really is quite unprecedented what we're seeing now. And as the scientists tell us, in lockstep with increases in carbon dioxide, we're seeing the increase in temperatures. So now we're at somewhere around 1.1 to 1.2 degrees of warming. We know 1.5 is the safe limit. But I think even looking around us now at 1.1 to 1.2 degrees of warming, we can see that the Earth is already too hot. It's already suffering terribly. We know that sea levels, we know extreme weather events of all sorts are becoming more frequent and more ferocious. We know sea levels are rising, lots of coastal destruction, but also whole island communities having to leave where they've lived for generations and try and find somewhere else to live. We know in other parts of the world that there are already millions of climate refugees who are having to leave their land because of lack of water, because of extreme heat, extreme drought, and try to find somewhere else that will welcome them and take them in. And we know those numbers are going to increase. We've had the sadness of watching the bleaching of our beloved Great Barrier Reef. And of course, we've all experienced those horrendous bushfires of 2019 to 2020. And I think we're just getting used to it, aren't we? All the time having yet another record-breaking event. You know, the floods in Germany, the floods in China, a 1 in 1,000 years event, the fires in Turkey, in North America, just around us all the time. So I think we have to accept that we're already at the start of catastrophic climate change, and that we have very little time left to act if we want to hand on a livable planet to the next generation. And that really puts us in a very, no other generation that has been, caring about kids, thinking about the upbringing of kids, no other generation has had to confront this sort of situation. So it's not surprising that many of us are a bit confused about how to go about that, or uncertain. It is new territory. So this, I don't know how many of you read The Conversation, but this was an article that came out just a couple of months ago from Will Stephan, who's one of our leading climate scientists at the ANU. And he talks about how we basically squandered the last decade when we should have been acting on climate change. And this decade is really the one where we have to act. But he points out about how everything we do makes the positive thing we do makes a difference. Every fraction of a degree of avoided warming matters and will be measured in human lives and ecosystems saved. So it's fairly powerful stuff. And this graph basically says the same thing. It says, it's talk about what we have to do and how fast we have to do it if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees, which we know is the limit beyond which we're likely to experience tipping points that we can't recover from. So if we'd started in 2020, we could have had a quite gentle decline in our emissions, quite a steady and easy decline. But given that we did do, governments, industries, corporations, us as citizens did so little to demand it, now that we're up to 2020, we have to really be acting amazingly fast if we want to get down to zero emissions by 2040. It really is a race now to try to get there. But with all of that, well, you do have to remember that we do know what to do. We all know about how to stop carbon emissions through renewable energy, through changing our transport, through changing agricultural practices. And I'm sure you're on top of all of that. And I'm sure you're also on top of the ways in which we need to draw down that excess carbon dioxide to bring it down to safe limits through drawdown technologies like reforestation and regenerative farming, and changing the way in which we build and travel and so on. So there are good grounds for what I call realistic hope that I'll come back to. And all really that is lacking is the political will for urgent action. And I think in countries like Australia, we know that that only happens when we demand it loudly enough to get those who have vested interests in continuing as we are, to persuade them that the movement is necessary. Let me just say a couple of words about COVID and climate change. It's interesting thinking back to the beginning of 2019 when we were being told, well, you know, just wash your hands, you know, all that, sing happy birthday 3 times while you wash your hands and everything will be all fine. We then realized that that really wasn't enough, and the tidal wave of COVID hit us. And then we became aware that in fact the economic consequences might be even greater than the disease itself. But then I think we have to accept that there are other tidal waves beyond that. So I assume that in a year's time, we will still have the painful memories and the painful after effects of COVID, but we will be more or less on top of it through vaccines. And I think what is going to be looming larger for us is climate change and the associated biodiversity collapse. Those are the things that are going to be front of mind in a year's time, if they're not already. But there are a whole lot of things we can learn through the pandemic, I think. One is reminding ourselves that both of these are the result of human activity, and they both were expectable things. But I think we've learned things. If we needed to learn it, we've learned that borders between countries are artificial, and between states, that global problems need global cooperation. That's equally true of climate change. I think a really important thing is we've learned that governments can really listen to the science when they want to. They've done well when they've followed the advice of the health scientists. And that, of course, is what climate scientists have been asking for a long time. We also, people often said, you know, can't expect rapid change. Government works slowly, but we saw that governments can take emergency action, that bringing in JobKeeper and JobSeeker and all those things that they did really fast because they recognized this was an emergency. They need to be doing the same, recognizing that we're in a climate emergency too. But we've seen that they can do it. And we also saw that people went along with it. They changed their own behavior fast when the need was explained to them. And I don't know if you remember, but the statistics on the level of trust in government, level of trust in in politicians went up hugely when they were speaking the truth, just telling the truth as it is. That really instilled trust and hope. So again, telling the truth about the climate crisis and acting on it can instill trust and hope. We also saw the amazing compassion and generosity that people showed to each other, helping each other out. Me being an oldie, I think I must have had about 15 offers from people in my neighbourhood to go and do the shopping for me or do anything else that needed to be done. And then I think the other thing that we learned was how we needed to talk to our kids to help support them through this. And I think a lot of that, we'll talk about more as we go along, also applies in relation to the climate crisis. Of course, now we're still in this, this point where we do have the opportunity to build back better, not to have a gas-led recovery, but actually to take this as an opportunity to remake the economy and the society in a way that is cleaner, fairer and healthier, and ensuring a livable planet for the next generation. There's some great work being done by groups like Beyond Zero Emissions, who've got a 1 million jobs plan, all based around renewables and regeneration. Climate Works, a number of things that have got really great visions for what we could be doing, even if we can't feel quite so optimistic that governments will go there right now. Okay, so that sort of reality of the climate crisis, we all know where greenhouse gases come from, about how it's basically from how our everyday lives, through our mining, production and use of fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, our use of it for transport, our use of it in industrial processes, also our industrial scale agriculture, particularly meat farming, deforestation, and of course all these horrible feedback loops that we are not entirely understood yet, but we know are out there, like when the permafrost in the Arctic thaws, the huge amounts of methane will be released from that. So basically what we're being asked to do is to change all those aspects of our lives at a government, at a corporation and in an everyday life situation, but that's all the things that need to be changing. So why aren't we doing more in this context? Well, from a psychological point of view, there are a whole lot of reasons why we minimize it or avoid confronting it. One that we used to apply, well, I don't think it really can now, but we used to think of climate change that was happening sometime out there in the future, or was happening over there, not right here. And so we didn't really need to focus on it. I think now when every news report contains something about the climate crisis, that's much harder to do now. I think most of us do recognize that it is here and now. But maybe instead of that, we're now getting, the report on the latest record-breaking hurricane or bushfire or whatever. Perhaps we have a tendency to get desensitized to it and to tune out. A really powerful one that does still apply is change is always difficult. We do resist change. It's more comfortable to continue on the way we are. So that's something we have to address. And an even more important one is, it's really uncomfortable to think about the reality of climate change. It's really painful, and we want to avoid those distressing feelings. And another one is there's a lot of people who say, yeah, I know it's real, I know it's happening, but I can't do anything about it. I don't know what I can do. They feel helpless, and so they do nothing and try to blank it out. And then, of course, there are those whose vested interests in the short term make them want to continue with business as usual, the fossil fuel companies and those who are profiting from them. So a question that I might go to suggest that you might want to talk about later on after my talk is this one of, recognizing this tendency to want to look away, to try to ignore it. It might be worth you having a bit of a conversation about how you respond to the reality of the climate crisis, embracing it or avoiding your feelings. And this comes from Psychology for a Safe Climate, a really great organization that's really useful if you're wanting to have support in dealing with the feelings aroused by climate change. they really push the idea that to get on top of our sense of grief about what's happening to the planet, we need to name it and to share it with trusted others in order to tame it. But I won't do more on that. Also, from a psychological point of view, my colleagues at the Australian Psychological Society and I and others came up with this model, Activate. I don't have time to talk about it in detail now, but really we've come up with these 8 strategies to deal both with our own tendencies to avoid climate change, but also to help other people to do so. Very, very, very briefly, this will be on a resource list that you can download from the web that I'll give to Nicole, or we can have it as part of the presentation that can be passed on to you. But the A is acknowledging feelings, as I just said, being emotionally honest. The C is for creating social norms. You know, say, well, yeah, of course I have a compost heap, doesn't everybody? Of course I take public transport when I can, doesn't everybody? This is something we're all doing. This is the norm. This is the way we behave these days. T is talking about it, breaking the silence, bringing it up in the staff room, talking to your neighbours, talking about it at the dinner table. Inspiring positive visions is a really important thing of building hope, showing how moving to a net zero world can be much healthier and much more positive. And I won't go through the rest of that. B is for valuing it, A is for act, T is for the time is now, and E is engage with nature, which I'll talk more about as we go along. So let's now turn to kids then, and why we need to be particularly worried about them. And if we start off just with physical health, the World Health Organization estimates that kids will bear 80% of the physical health impacts of climate change, which includes not just the deaths and injuries that come about by being caught up in an extreme weather event like a flood or a bushfire or a hurricane, but also the infectious diseases and the heat-related illnesses that are becoming more prevalent as temperatures go up. So we know that things like malaria and dengue fever are already increasing in prevalence, increasing their range. And then in many parts of the world, where climate change results in a lack of clean water, lack of food, malnutrition and diarrheal diseases that are already big killers of kids in the majority world, the developing world, are going to be already increasing. And of course, I don't need to say to you guys, but their greater vulnerability is because their physiological systems are not yet mature, because kids tend to have much more direct contact with the environment, so they can pick up toxins and things more easily. Big one is because they're dependent on adults. So if their parents are injured, in extremist cases died, if they've been separated from them through forced migration or relocation, or even if their parents are just highly stressed at trying to work out what to do now that we've lost our home, now that we've lost our livelihoods, how do we put our lives back together? We know that kids suffer. Kids' health can suffer. And of course, they also will be experiencing these things, many kids, not just once, but multiple times over their lifetimes. So even though kids can be very resilient to one event, when it keeps on accumulating, it gets harder to deal with. And that's not just the exposure to the extreme weather events themselves, but also all the things that flow on from them, from food and water shortages through increased violence, through forced migration and so on. But turning to this, this is one of my the ones on justice that I think is worthwhile thinking about. It comes from a UNICEF publication called Unless We Act Now. And it goes through all the different sorts of things that will come about through climate change. This particular one is about drought. And it basically is just underlining the injustices involved. So a kid whose family is exposed to drought, who comes from a wealthier family, might still have a hard time, but they're likely to make a speedy recovery because they can migrate more safely. Even when food prices skyrocket, they can still afford to buy food. they can more easily access clean water even when it's in very short supply. They can continue to get into hospitals and things, even they can jump the queue. They can find shelter, and very importantly, they can make sure that the kid stays in school, their schooling and other social services are not disrupted. And none of those apply for a kid in a poorer family. So we're talking here about the majority world, the developing world, where 80% of kids live, versus the developed world. But we're also talking about differences within, by wealth, with kids within our own community. For those in poorer families, none of those things apply, and they can get on this downward spiral to long-term deprivation, sometimes lifelong deprivation. So as I say, there are a whole lot of justice issues involved in climate change, and this is one of them. But turning now to psychology, the psychological impacts of climate change, I think, are at least as worrying as the physical health impacts. And we have to think about two different categories here. One is for kids who directly experience climate-related events, and it may be that some of the kids in your schools have experienced some of these. Climate might have been part of the reason for some families to have migrated here, have come as refugees and so on. But for most of our kids, they haven't yet had direct experience. But there's been lots of research on what happens if kids are caught up in hurricanes or floods or fires, which shows that rates of post-traumatic stress go up, as do depression and anxiety. Many kids have sleep problems, have trouble going to sleep, sleeping on their own, staying asleep, having nightmares, and so on. And also cognitive and learning problems, sometimes as a result of the stresses that they're going through, for some kids because it results in a break in their education. School's no longer an option. And we know that these things, again, as with physical health, if it's not the first difficult event they've been through, their symptoms tend to be worse and to stay for longer. But most kids, if we can continue to support them with a lot of parent and family support, if they can get back to their routines of going to school and school is supportive, most kids recover and show amazing resiliency after being through one of these climate-related events. So in a way, it's the second category that is more problematic and is likely to be the one that is an issue for you guys to a greater extent. And that's simply the vicarious experience of climate change, simply knowing about it, knowing that it's happening. So we know from surveys around the world now that most kids do know about climate change and are worried about how it'll impact on their future. So the figures are now mostly in the 80 to 90%, depending on the survey. There are some surveys, depends how you ask the question and how the survey's done. So some find lower rates than that, but most of the surveys have 80 to 90% of kids knowing about climate change and being worried about it. So this fear, anxiety, and worry is very real. Also distress and grief, sense of loss of the future they thought they were going to have, sense of loss of beloved places, of nature. A whole lot of anger and frustration at my generation and yours for having allowed this to happen and doing so little about it. A sense of helplessness, that there's nothing that they can do about it, and worse still, of despair and hopelessness. We're not going to get on top of this. I don't really have a future. And that's not the way we want our kids to be living their lives. So these are just some quotes from kids, what they have to say about it. I've just, this paper has just come out in the British Journal of Psychiatry that I did with a young climate activist friend, colleague, an 18-year-old, and we interviewed a number of kids around the world about how they felt about climate change. And this is just two quotes here. So Arent in Italy says, "I'm worried about it because the future of us young people is in danger. If governments don't act quickly, we'll not have a future where we can live in peace with our children." And Alice in Australia says, "My future feels dire and my decision to have kids has been impacted because of fear of food shortages, droughts, fires and floods and so on." And that's not an uncommon response to have, especially from teenagers. This quote in blue comes from a survey done by the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience of 1,500 young Australians. And some of the young people summarised their findings, saying we're aware of climate change, we're worried about it, we're worried about the repercussions that it'll have globally, regionally, and here at home. We're worried about experiencing climate-related disasters due to a lack of action by those in power. And we're worried about what this means for us, our families, our friends, in the present and in the future. So again, kids are really expressing this. And then, of course, we have the wonderful example of Greta Thunberg, who says it like it is, so boldly and bravely, and says, I want you to panic, to feel the fear that I feel every day. So this eco-anxiety is certainly around. Eco-anxiety is not a diagnosis, but it's a catch cry, if you like, a summary term, to refer to watching the American Psychological Society or Association summarizes at the feelings that come up when you watch the slow and the seemingly irrevocable impacts of climate change unfold, and worrying about the future for oneself and children and later generations. And, you know, there's been a lot of talk about it now, but I think this quote below is the right one. It's pointing out that this is actually a rational response. It's not an irrational, it's not a pathological response. It's a realistic response to a real situation. So as Graham Norton says, maybe it represents a long overdue outbreak of sanity, a sign that we're alive and responsive to our context. That doesn't mean that for some kids it isn't extremely uncomfortable and can be paralyzing and awful, but it's also can be very motivating. It can lead to action, both as adults and kids. Okay, so what then can we do to support kids? Well, there are four main categories of things, none of which are rocket science, probably things that you do anyway, but I think there are things that that are going to be important for helping kids in this situation. And the first is to respond to their feelings and concerns. So some kids, you will know, some kids express their feelings very openly, maybe sometimes a bit too much. Some kids feel shy about talking about their feelings, or they feel silly. Boys in particular think it's not cool to show that they care. A lot of kids don't believe that adults are really interested in their feelings. I was involved in a youth forum, and I guess it was the year before last, because we were meeting in person, and I said, do you think that adults listen to kids? And there was this resounding no from all around me, the kids not feeling like adults listen to them. So it's really important to create times and places for them to share their feelings. Just as one idea, something, I'm old enough to have been around at the time of the nuclear threat, when we were really worried about how kids were handling this possibility their lives might end in a nuclear conflagration just like that. And we organised with the education department a project called Letters to World Leaders, where kids around Victoria were invited to write a letter to a world leader of their choice about their hopes and fears for the future. No more priming than that, no more talking about the context. And we had about 30,000 kids writing letters, which were all sent into the GPO that was then in the big GPO building in Burke Street. And they mostly chose to write to Gorbachev, the president of Russia at the time, and to Reagan, the president of the US, and to Maggie Thatcher in the UK, and to Hawke here in Australia. And they were saying things like, it's a big fear for a little person. They're saying things like, you tell us to solve our problems peacefully, but you're threatening to blow up the world to solve your problems. All sorts of things, the very powerful things they said. And all these letters were collected at the GPO, and lots of kids came in to help sort them into these great big mail bags, which we then presented to the ambassadors from each of those countries. And that was all well and good. But the most important thing about it was that it opened up conversations with parents and with teachers. So many of the parents and teachers had no idea their kids knew about this or cared about it. And it was a fantastic conversation opener. So it might be something that you can think about doing within your schools. It's really important to listen to what they say and to avoid that temptation to say, yeah, but it's okay, don't worry, everything will be all right. We need to recognize their feelings as valid, and recognizing it yourself, saying, yeah, I know it is a big problem, I'm really scared about it, a bit scared about it too, is often a helpful response. But to pair it with messages of hope and efficacy that I'll move to in a second. And I don't need to say to you teachers, it's really important to find out what they know and to build their understanding. There are some kids who, you know, see some of the signs around and they think that all Melbourne is going to go underwater, or the world is going to explode into flames. There are misconceptions we need to know about so we can correct them. And, you know, there's a huge temptation to shield kids from the unpleasant truth of climate change and other unpleasant truths. But we can't. The cat is out of the bag. They already know about it. And nor should we. The Convention on the Rights of the Child says that kids have a right to know about things that are going to affect their future and to be involved in doing something about them. So one thing is to respond to their questions honestly, and I'll talk about age in a minute. But the important thing is to build their knowledge, not just about what is going to happen with climate change, but more importantly about what causes it, and even more importantly about the solutions to it. So I'm sure you'd all be on top of that. The third thing is building what I call realistic hope or courage. And that isn't the Pollyanna-ish, everything will be all right, or what Scott Morrison said to the kids of Australia when they were all going out on strike. He said, you're suffering from needless anxiety. We know that dismissing kids' feelings is the worst thing you can do. But acknowledging that it's a huge and an urgent problem, but that we do know what to do, and we're getting new ideas about what to do all the time, that lots of good people are working on it, not just the scientists and the technologists coming up with new technological solutions, but also the people who are working so hard to persuade the decision makers, the people in government, the people in corporations, all those people who are working to try to get change to happen fast. It's a really good time to talk about all the big problems that we've solved before. Think of apartheid, think about slavery, think about women's suffrage, think about the environmental problems we've solved, and you know, have that as a class exercise, thinking about those things. And what comes out from doing that is the recognition that in all those cases, it was people power that happened. It was when enough people got out there and demanded action that it happened. So you're really building this sense that when people do get together, they can make change, building that sense of collective efficacy as well as their own self-efficacy. And then the fourth thing that I would say is build their capacity to take action. So I'm always saying the best antidote to anxiety is action. And the more I do in this area, the more convinced I am that that's true. And we know it's true with our own anxieties, whatever it's about. Once we start to take action, we feel better. We feel a bit more in control. Many possible steps for that. One is being a good role model yourself. So when you take public transport to school, talk to the kids about it and why you're doing it, and make the link to climate change. When you're not bringing your lunch to school in plastic, point it out to the kids and explain your reasons for doing it in relation to climate change. All sorts of things we can do that in that way. Treating kids not just as victims, but also as problem solvers is, of course, really important, and that they have a right to be involved. I think it's also really important to treat kids not just as consumers, but also as citizens, and to think of ourselves in the same way too. So, you know, it's great to be doing waste reduction projects at school, or encouraging them not to buy so many clothes, or, you know, whatever it is, the thinking about eating less meat, etc. All of those are really good and really important. But even if we all did that, that wouldn't be enough to stop climate change getting out of control. What we need is action at a greater level. So this is a fantastic time when we can be building those active citizenship skills with our kids. Teaching them how you can have an influence on decision makers, helping them to have an influence, whether it's going up to the local supermarket and asking them to stop wrapping everything in plastic, or whether it's going to visit their MP or asking your local member of parliament to come and talk to the kids about what they're doing about climate change, or to showcase what you're doing at school with your local MP or the local council, whatever it is. But building those capacities to have an influence on decision makers. And the other is doing this stuff on your own is really tough. We need the support of each other in doing this, and for kids in particular, that's true. So pointing out to kids how you learn a lot more if you do it with other kids or with other adults, and for that matter. It's much more effective, you can get a whole lot more done, and it's a whole lot more fun. So those are the four big categories of things that I think are helpful for kids. Basically what we're doing with a lot of this is building this sense of collective efficacy. So if each of us runs away from this great big problem of climate change, it's going to get us. But if we all gang up on this problem, we have a chance of getting the great big fish. So taking age and ability into account, I'm a bit shy about saying this to you teachers because you know all of this, but I'll go through it fast anyway, and there might be some useful things in it. But the first thing is to remember when we talk to kids about climate change, our aim is not to scare them, but we do need to acknowledge that they probably already know enough to be worried, and they soon will, and that our responsibility is to help them to cope with that knowledge. They have a right to know. What we need to do is to help them cope with that knowledge. So with this is early primary school age, simple explanations as much as possible in response to their questions. So having an atmosphere where they can ask their questions, or in the context of an activity. We don't need to be going into all the nuts and bolts of it. Really important to model pro-environmental behaviour and explain it, particularly for this age group. So just making it normal that, you know, you turn the light off when you leave the classroom, that you try to save paper where you can, that you're, you know, what are you doing up at the front there? Oh, I'm just writing a letter to the council to ask them to get more electric vehicle charging stations in the council area. Whatever it is, model it and let the kids see it. Really important to set high expectations. So in this classroom, we, you know, don't bring our lunch to school in plastic. We turn the lights off when we leave, all those sustainability things. Just make it as just the normal of what you do. This one I'm sure you're very much on top of, but really important with little kids in particular, to give them the opportunity to fall in love with nature. That will happen in their families for some families, but not for others. So we know that getting that sense of caring about nature doesn't just happen naturally. Kids need to have a lot of time of being comfortable in nature, whether it's playing with mud pies down at the creek, or it's planting trees, or it's lovely projects like what Hannah was talking about of going to look at the Skeleton Creek and looking at biodiversity there. But just comfortable times of being in nature, so that then you develop that sense of being with nature, being codependent with nature, being part of nature. And then from that follows that wish to be protecting nature. So that's a really important thing. So activities around nature and environmental protection, using all the senses, is a very nice thing to be doing with little kids. And I used to say focus on small local actions, like creating a veggie garden or an Indigenous garden, or going down to clean up at the local creek and plant trees, and putting in gardens on the median strips in the classes and things. But I'm more and more questioning that, because when I give these talks in the community, when there are young kids in the audience, they jump up and say, we don't want to do just those little things. We know what climate change, it's much bigger than this. We want to be doing bigger things than this. We want to be involved in some of the bigger things. So I think you really need to be reading where your kids are at and give them the opportunity to do the bigger things that are having a larger impact as well. And of course, there's lots of chances to encourage creativity around this topic. For older kids from late primary on, all of those same things apply. But on top of that, there are a few other things. So we know that they know a lot and they want to be listened to. So taking their ideas seriously is really important. Obviously, when we move on to more complex explanations, we can be making the link between what's happening at the local level and what's happening at the, how that'll impact what's happening globally, as well as how what's happening globally is affecting what's happening around us here. The same with links between what happened in the past and where we are now, and how what we do now will affect the future. A lot of the kids of this age care a lot about fairness. How often do you hear, it's not fair? They care about fairness and justice. And so a lot of kids are going to know that kids in the developing world are doing it much tougher than they are. They're going to worry about kids in the future and whether they'll get to experience nature the way they do. They're going to care about nature, about polar bears, about threatened species, about the barrier reef and so on. It's really important that we really value those values, to say, I'm really pleased and proud of you that you care about these things. This is a really important thing that you care about. We really need to build these bigger than self values. They're very sensitive to hypocrisy, so practicing what you preach in the classroom in terms of school policies and practices. If we're not doing that, the kids are going to know that. And in the same way, as I've said before, they want to be engaged in activities that they know is proportional to the threat that's around. So they know that a veggie garden is not going to cut the mustard with climate change. It's a great thing to do, but it can't be all that happens. And they want to be involved in that. They're also peer oriented, so helping them to do things together. And for kids, the kids who are most concerned about climate change and are expressing it, encourage them to join groups where they can find enough other people around them who care as deeply as they do, and they can share their concerns and they can share ideas about what to do. And they're action oriented. So really important, as I said, building the active citizenship skills, their sense of the global world, and support their activism. Not all kids are going to want to be active by going out on the streets and protesting. They might want to do it in very different ways, but whatever way they're wanting to do it, I think it's important that we support them. So I went through that pretty fast, but and some of what I've said comes from, is covered in this little booklet that we wrote for the Australian Psychological Society for parents, once we became aware that so many parents were confused about how they should be supporting their kids. And you can download that, and the link will be on the resources list that I'll give you later. And we also wrote another little booklet, which is really thinking about what sort of skills and attributes are kids going to need for the world they're going to be growing up in. So not only are they likely, even if we stay below 1.5 degrees, which is looking a bit uncertain at the moment, but even if we did that, they're still, for this century, they're still going to be experiencing a lot more climate disruption. So it's highly likely that they will be involved in climate impacts of one sort or another, including millions of climate refugees wanting to come to Australia to try and find a new home. But also that transition, that fast transition I talked to a net zero world, that's going to involve massive societal change too. So we tried to think about what are the skills and attributes that kids are going to need. And this partly comes from my research in the longitudinal studies I mentioned before. But we think there are a range of personal things like self-regulation, knowing how to manage their own feelings, how to manage their behaviour, to control their behaviour. Those bigger than self values that I mentioned just before are really important. Self-esteem, self-efficacy, feeling like you can make a difference. Coping, I could spend a whole hour talking about different coping strategies, but being focused, not using emotion-focused coping, but problem and meaning focused coping is important. At the interpersonal level, we are going to have to work together a lot more than we probably have in the past. Trying to be an individualist type person is not going to work. So having good skills in cooperation and collaboration is really important. Lots of sources of conflict in the world that they're moving into. So having very strong negotiation and conflict resolution skills, knowing how to solve problems peacefully and collaboratively. Knowing how to build and maintain strong supportive relationships is going to be really important. We won't get through this without strong relationships with family, with peers, with teachers, and so on. And then there are the social and civic skills. So being oriented to your community, being interested in your community, interested in volunteering, being a joiner, knowing how to speak out on the things that about the things that you care about, believing that people working together can make a difference, knowing how to act to influence decision makers, and having not just a parochial worldview, but having a sense of the world as a whole, are things that we believe are going to be important. And they're part of what positive development in late adolescence and adulthood looks like as well. And I would be bold enough to assert that these might in fact be more important than the STEM skills that we're always being told that we need to be developing in our kids. So from our longitudinal data sets where we followed kids, tracked kids through from infancy up to adulthood, we were able to look back to see what were the characteristics of kids who did have these strong positive development characteristics when they got to be young adults. And what we found was 4 main characteristics. And the interesting thing here is how school relates to these. So having positive and supportive relationships with parents and with peers, but also from teachers from primary school on, was a predictor of later having strong positive development. Being a contributing member of their community, which might mean helping the neighbours with their rubbish bins when they're little kids. It might mean babysitting for the neighbours when you're a bit older. It might be volunteering with organisations, and being interested in politics was another predictor. Self-regulation, knowing how to manage your own feelings, knowing how to manage your behaviour was important. But the 4th one was school connectedness. Kids who felt like school was a place where they were valued and where they were being prepared for what life was going to be, the future life was going to be. That sense of connectedness to school was one of the 4 predictors. So I think that really shows how important you guys are. So let me come back to agency, this capacity to contribute meaningfully. I think these 2 quotes summarize it quite nicely. Hart and colleagues have done lots of youth participation work and work around climate change. And they talk about how from their work, they can see how developing the skills and having the opportunities to actively contribute to combating climate change can provide important psychological protection, helping young people to feel more in control, more hopeful and more resilient. And Kagara and Selby from a teaching perspective say much the same thing. Kids who have knowledge about climate change, understand the causes, perceive that they can act in meaningful ways, and that society and individuals can act and make a change, feel hope. So I think that notion of building kids' sense of agency is really important, and I know that it's be central in your minds too. I find this little graph quite useful, this sort of continuum of levels of agency. So this graph was based around disaster resilience or disaster risk reduction. But I think we can apply it in the context of climate change too. So it starts off, and you can think about this as being an age continuum. For older kids, you might aim up here, and for littler kids, you might aim here, or just project by project. What sort of agency am I expecting from my kids? So to the knowledge level, I'm learning about disasters and how to stay safe. At the action to protect, I'm helping to protect my community. I'm influencing the way my community protects itself, and right up to action to transform. I'm helping to change policies that affect me, my community, and my country. And I think we need to think about where our projects sit on a continuum like that. And of course, this is this UNICEF publication I mentioned before when I showed you that graph about drought and how it affected wealthy and poorer kids. But it's a nice little publication. It's worth looking at, mainly based around people in the kids in the developing world. But it really reinforces how important it is to listen to and act on children's perspectives of climate change. Oh, there's that quote from Hart again. I forgot to get rid of that. But in terms of transformative action, of course, we have no better example than the wonderful Greta Thunberg. It's hard to believe it's only 3 years that she started her school strike movement. But showing how what she was saying was resonating so much with kids. A mere 3 months later, we had 30,000 kids around Australia going on school strike. I wonder how many of their parents knew that, and how many of their teachers knew that these kids cared so deeply about climate change. And then a mere less than a year later, we had 6 million kids worldwide going out to demand action for climate change to save their futures. So there are still people who say we shouldn't, kids shouldn't be going to school. They should be staying in school and learning their 3 hours. We shouldn't be supporting them to go on school strike, or they're being manipulated. But in fact, what the kids say, I think, really counters that. So what Alice says is that through being involved in the school strike movement, I've learned how to talk to authority figures, recognize my rights, speak confidently in public, communicate non-violently, and work effectively in a collective. And she talks about how taking action creates a sense of solidarity, of cooperation and productivity in the face of despair. And Andeli talks about how he learned skills that are being really useful in his work now. And Emma talks about how it can be rewarding, it can be, and how it builds up her skills. But we also have to recognize that if kids feel like they're doing this on their own, it can be really a huge burden. So Andeli talks about how sometimes it makes him feel empowered, but other times deflated, like no matter what I do, it won't work. And Emma says it can feel lonely and full of despair and anxiety. Young people feel like they're fighting a battle they need to win, but they know they might never, and the impact on mental health can be great. So it's really important, I think, the messages from that are just really strong, that we need to acknowledge that this is how kids, some kids at least, are feeling, help them manage those feelings in the sorts of ways we've talked about, build their sense that they're part of the process of working with other people to make change. What they're doing does make a difference. Make sure that they have strong social support networks around them, and help. There are a few kids who get so focused on this that it just consumes their lives. So helping to create some balance in their lives is really important. And if they are wanting to be active in any ways, take action on this, recognizing that that's a really strong way for them to get a handle on their anxiety, and support them in their activism is really important. And for them to see they're not being asked to do all this by themselves. So many kids feel like we've dropped the bundle and it's up to them to do it. We have to show them we're doing stuff ourselves. We're taking action ourselves in whatever way we can, and model that for them and let them know that we're doing it and they're not alone. A few other ideas which are probably not very new to you. You know more about this than I do. But I guess one feeling I have sometimes about the sustainability education is you're doing really useful things that are really valid, but sometimes the links to climate change aren't made as strongly as they can. So if you're doing a waste reduction project, you know, you can say, isn't that great? There'll be less plastic getting into the oceans and that'll be good for the whales. But you can also say, isn't that great? We're using less plastic bottles. That means we're using less. Plastic bottles are made with oil. That means we're using less fossil fuels. And when stuff goes into rubbish tips, a huge amount of methane gets released, and that's part of the climate change story. So make very explicit links to climate change in all of those projects, whatever they are. I think making climate change an integral part of the curriculum is a goal that we should all have in our schools. And I know for some schools are very much on side with that and some are not. There are places like New Zealand, all kids, 15-year-old kids are getting access to climate change curricula. Italy has made it compulsory. It's, you know, it's happening. And there are lots of great curriculum resources around, as I'm sure you know. You could work to get the school community to declare a climate emergency. There's a whole, there's the website here for climate emergency declarations. And that makes a really positive statement. Supporting your kids to be involved in the school strike. The Letters to Leaders project was one idea. Developing, because for some kids, climate change still is fairly distant. Think of developing sister school relationships with schools in Africa or Asia or wherever, Latin America, where the experience of climate change is much more here and now, and let them learn from each other. Arranging visits with MPs. The energy and waste audits are great, and I'm sure you know about all the tools for doing that. But I would say make sure the focus is on reducing and reusing and not just recycling. I think there's lots of opportunity. There's lots of songs about climate change. I'm a member of Melbourne Climate Choir, and there's a whole repository of climate songs. If you're interested in that, there's a website, I think it's called Climate Canaries, where they've got all sorts of songs, often to well-known tunes. There are a whole lot of Christmas carols, which have now got climate words to it and so on. So that's getting the kids to have some climate songs in. And there are ones about making compost and things like that as well. Have it as a theme in the school play. Offering talks for parents. There are probably lots of parents in your school communities who are not quite sure how to support their kids in the era of climate change. You could encourage them to join the Australian Parents for Climate Action, which is an amazingly productive, active group. And one of their projects is to try to get all schools and childcare centres to be solar powered. Go out and talk to your local businesses to try to get them to take action in all their ways. So that's just a few ideas to throw in there, and I'm sure you've got zillions of ideas yourselves. Oh, I do want to do one little plug. So one group I've been involved in since the time of the nuclear threat back in the 1980s is Psychologists for Peace. And we have now recognised climate change as the biggest current threat to peace. So we're having an award for kids aged 12 to 24. So if you're working with kids in secondary school, they'd be eligible. For groups of kids to get together, any number from 2 up, and to work together on a project that is designed to get a particular audience, a particular group to take action on climate change. So it could be the school community, it could be parents, it could be fossil fuel companies, it could be the government, and they could do it with a video, with a YouTube video, with a podcast, with putting on a play, with putting up posters, or however they want, and they can get a prize for doing so. So let me encourage you to go to this website where you'll find these posters that you can put up around the school, as well as all the instructions about how to apply. So that's just a little plug from me. And one more little plug is from my local climate action group, Darebin Climate Action Now. We found a lot of people in the community weren't up on the basics of climate change. So we came up with what we call Climate Change 101, a poster that can be A4 or A3 size or bigger. But it might be a good thing to get copies of, to put up in the school classroom if you're one of those teachers that is struggling to get the rest of the school community on side. Put it up and have it as a conversation starter. And that I don't think I'll go through this. So this is, I guess you know about the journal Environmental Education Research. It's a good little journal, and last year they had a paper which was an evaluation of successful climate change education programs, which I found really interesting in terms of the things that they found important characteristics of successful programs. So that might be something you want to look up too. And then these are all these resources that I won't talk about, but you can have access to. They're all on the websites. And I think that's more or less where I will stop. I do have a couple of questions the question that I'd raised before, another couple of questions for conversation, but we probably have time for a bit of question and answer first, Nicole.
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody's got any questions, jump on in. You can turn your mics on, or if you're more comfortable to type them into the chat, you can do that too.
Let me just go on to the, so this was one question that I thought you might like to be in breakout rooms and think about, how you embrace or avoid feelings about climate change. It's sometimes nice to be able to share your thinking around things like that. And then this is a more concrete one about thinking about how, as teachers, we can best engage kids and build their sense of agency. How can we explicitly link sustainability projects to climate change? And how can we simultaneously help kids to understand about the climate crisis and do something meaningful to it? And how can schools engage parents around it? But I can leave you to think about those questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And that's been brilliant. I mean, tons and tons and tons of fabulous information, and there are lots for us to chew on, and tools and resources that we can be having a look at. I think we'll give it a chance just to have another minute if anybody's got any questions they want to throw in. And then how are we doing for time? Oh, we're nearly there. But yeah, so just open the floor. Has anyone got a question?
Hi, please excuse the music in the background. The bell's just about to ring. I put in the chat and just asking whether you, or if you know of any other groups or organisations that offer parent talks. I know it's ideal to probably get someone from within the school to give a talk, but just in terms of, I think my school community would be really receptive to something like what you've gone through with us today.
Thank you. Yeah, I can be persuaded to give talks. Parenting, psychology for a safe climate. Also do talks that tends to be more feeling oriented, helping parents to get on top of their feelings so they feel more comfortable talking with their kids about it. But I have variations on this sort of talk that I do for parents, and I have talked at a number of schools. And I know a couple of other people who are able to do it too.
Thank you.
I can't actually see the chat because I've still got my PowerPoint open, but I can close that if you've got it, unless you wanted to leave it up there to have those questions up there. What do you reckon, Nicole?
I'm just having a look there. Oh yeah, the only other question was the same thing, also asking you if you do anything. Apparently you're in demand.
Well, you're welcome to contact me. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, if everybody's up for it, it might be quite nice just to take a couple of minutes in a breakout room and just have a little chat and talk about those questions. Those are great questions, and it's a nice opportunity to network and touch base and actually stretch our brains a little bit after this. So I've allocated 2 breakout rooms and just said to assign everybody automatically. I will open the rooms now, and if everybody wants to, you can head out into your rooms, have a little chat, and I'll call you back in about 5-6 minutes, something like that.
Nicole, I think I might leave you to have those conversations on your own.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Anne. That was absolutely brilliant. And I feel like it was, like I say, my brain is kind of going, wow, there's so much to take on there, but really inspiring stuff. Lots of really good capacitating stuff, I think, too, which is what we all need. You know, I feel myself, I can sometimes feel a bit overwhelmed by these situations. And it's lovely to have, right, I have tools, I have artillery, I can deal with it.
Excellent, good. I'm glad it was helpful.
It was very much. So thank you so much for making time.
I'll just leave my PowerPoint open in case people want to see that screen.
Excellent. That's a good idea.
But I won't join a room.
Super. Thank you so much, Anne. You have a lovely afternoon, and thank you for making the time for us today. Really appreciate that.
You know, globe, if that makes sense. So it's starting at the beginning from home. And for example, today we started with looking after our homes. Why do we look after our own homes? And then from that we can build on.
Mm-hmm. So they can make links and probably take actions. That's probably how they get engaged in it, I suppose.
Yeah, but certainly the understanding is the basis.
Yep. What about you, Melissa? Have you got anything happening along these lines?
I think bringing it up at assembly is a big part of it, so that you know that all your whole cohort of students and all staff are across it as well, because I think it can be really daunting for some staff that maybe don't know where to start or what's age appropriate. So using our sort of green team or our ResourceSmart team to engage with the whole school community rather than relying on that information to filter down, because sometimes it just doesn't happen. So that's sort of something that we're working on at the moment, that it's just becomes the norm that it's discussed in that kind of forum.
Yeah, that's great. And I agree with what you were saying, Melissa, that it has to be everybody's going on the journey. Like, yes, we're engaging the students, but we need to engage the teachers who may not feel comfortable to teach the content, and then also the parents, so that or carers and the wider community, so everybody knows what we're doing, and they kind of hold you to account as well, and then they can chat about it at home.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right, question 2. Do we explicitly link our sustainability projects to climate change? How can we best do so?
We're sort of new to, so we're a brand new school this year, so this is a new journey for us. So we don't really have projects up and running as yet. So I predict that in the future, that because we haven't started them yet, and now that I've seen this sort of prompt, that will be in the back of our mind with anything that comes up.
Maybe in the unit planners, if you're planning any sort of sustainability units, that it's actually in the template, like what are the direct links to climate change that teachers need to make explicit. Kiara, did you have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, we do a lot of projects. So, well, we've been doing them over time. I especially do, and I know that that's a very small part of things, but we've done recycling with the kids for years. We run a pop-up shop and we make things we make recycled paper from the paper that we collect and things like that, and making those links with the kids, but also that connectedness with nature. So we've got a big garden. We do a lot of things about, with seed saving and things like that, and having all those connections for the students makes them more aware of, I think, that connection to these climate change issues as well.
Love of nature, so they actually want to act on it.
Yeah,
that's cool. All right, question 3. How can we simultaneously help children to A, understand about the climate crisis, and B, do something meaningful to address it? I reckon you kind of spoke about that before, Kiara, when you were saying it all starts with understanding. Like, their actions will be more powerful once they have an understanding, like a kid-friendly understanding of where they're at. And like the presenter said, they already kind of know a bit, but it's probably our job to clarify and help them find an action that's actually meaningful and possible that they can take.
Yeah,
I like, oh, sorry.
Sorry, no, you go, Melissa.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I liked that she talked about like, what do you do to, so I've jotted down for our green team, like, what do you know about climate change? Actually asking them what they know. So just rather than making assumptions like, oh, they're only little, or, you know, they might not know much, or they just link it, sustainability is all about recycling for little kids. They probably do know more, but we need to know exactly what they do know so that we can best provide solutions for them.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, I can't remember what I was going to say.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's all right. Yes, sorry, I'll leave that one.
And the last one, number 4, how can your school best engage parents around the climate crisis?
Well, actually, I remember what I was going to say before, and that ties in perfectly with this, because I engage with the teachers and with parents through the newsletter, but with teachers I also let them know when there's, you know, World Environment Day or Earth Day, any Tree Day, which we just had the other day, so things like that, and share links to that. But our school newsletter is where I have a little section and give tips and information and things like that.
So regular, kind of just regular, keeping it on the radar.
Yeah.
What about you, Melissa? Or you may not have started it.
Yeah, we're sort of just in the process of setting up, but like I said before, with the assembly, that's definitely a big part of it. And then we're going to put out our first, we don't really do newsletters, we have Compass, so we use Compass Push for everything, but we do have like a Facebook page where like you can attach PDFs and those kind of things. So making sure that that information is not only going to the students but to the parents, so that they can have those discussions at home, and it's not just the teacher sort of preaching or telling them information that's actually becoming part of their daily lives with outside of that school boundary.
Yeah. And I'm finding we've got a parent community that really wants to be involved, and because of Corona there's not a lot of opportunities, but I think putting like structures and policies in place so parents can form like a subcommittee of parent council, so they can actually, like, they can be the garden club, or they
Is everybody back? Oh, hold on, we seem to be missing one group. Or maybe they've run away. All right, guys, well, just to finish up, I just wanted to say thank you very, very much for making the time this afternoon. I found it incredibly useful, I must be honest. And yeah, it's a pity that a lot of schools have missed out on that, but we will be sharing that anyway. I know you guys are pretty much under the pump, having done this homeschool kind of back and forward nonsense. So hopefully we can get through that now. But yeah, we'll be distributing the notes on this one as well, and a link to the video if you do want to watch it again. And if you would like to share it with other staff in your school, you can absolutely do that. That would be great. I think some very valuable things have come out there, and just how important it is to put climate change on the forefront and know that what we're doing is actually, it's not about reducing litter, it's about stopping climate change. That's our major agenda. And that's just, it's been great to hear Anne remind me of that, and remember what what needs to be at the forefront of our mind in everything that we do. One of the things I love about the ResourceSmart program is that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking action, and it's a great way to capacitate kids. And I think, yeah, we must use that, and we can sell that to our principals and the staff and boards and teachers as well. That this is an amazing program working to quite literally save the world. You know, sounds cheesy, but that's what we do. All right, everybody, thank you very much. Just a last little bit of business. Next term, I'm hoping that we can still go ahead with our program in person. So we were looking at a date of the 12th of October, and hopefully to get Truganina South to be able to host us again. We will persevere, and hopefully that'll finally come together. So they've still agreed to help us, which is brilliant, to host us. So at this stage, we're proposing the 12th of October. We thought trying to get it in early, near the beginning of the term, is a good idea before everybody's diaries get absolutely filled up, because term 4 is always a busy one. So that's what we're targeting at the moment. And if there is anything in particular that you want to have addressed in that session, or any particular talks that you'd like to have or support that you'd like to have, we really do very much welcome your input in what you would like to hear from us. If you want a professional development day or whatever you'd like to do, please do drop me a line. In the absence of Nicole for a while before we fill her position, I'll be the kind of go-to person. So do feel free to drop me a line at any stage. And yeah, if there's anything I can help you with, I'm here. Anything else from anybody?
Just wanted to thank you for such an inspiring session. I've come away with a lot of information today, and I look forward to going into those resources in more detail. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I also found it quite inspiring, so that's great. All right, everybody, you have lovely afternoons. Go and get the last of the sunshine, and we will be in touch shortly. And as I said, I'm here all the time. Anything you need, just drop us a line. Okay, take care, everyone.